What's up, gentlemen? This is Rising Phoenix Podcast, the podcast about how to rise up after your divorce. I'm your host, Michael Rhodes. Let's get into it. Joining me today is Kaytee. Kaytee, let's just jump right into it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I specialize in family trauma and intimate partner violence and relationship trauma. I recently published a book. Actually, it wasn't recently. It was a year ago called Invisible Bruises. I have a blog on Psychology Today under the same name, Invisible Bruises. And I have a podcast, Kaytee with a Y.
Oh, okay. So yeah, your one of your articles on or one of your blog posts on Psychology Today is what brought me to you. And it was essentially, and I just read it today, so forgive me if I butcher the title, but I think it was somewhere along the lines of, can people that have been through trauma have a healthy relationship?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And so that's why I wanted you on. Trauma is a frequent topic on this podcast because I believe divorce is a trauma. So
for sure.
Let's define that. What is trauma? Number one, and then there's sort of some follow up to that.
So trauma is so hard to define. It's like saying, like, how do you define, life? I mean, trauma, it's subjective and then it's objective at the same time. So clinicians always start by saying, there's big T and little t trauma. Like big T is like, okay, if you had, something happen like an assault, or if you were in a war zone or something horrible like that you went through. And then little t could be like, verbal abuse or being, fired from a job or things like that you identify as being traumatic, and maybe there was a bunch of things that happened, together can equal the same kind of effects as a big T, so to speak. That kind of makes sense.
Yep. And so the question then is divorce a trauma?
Oh, absolutely. And I work every day with, survivors of relationship trauma and things like that. And of course, not every divorce leads people to therapy, but there's grief that comes with it. There's abandonment that comes with it, and things like that. And so, I mean, there's an ending of a relationship, so it is absolutely traumatic. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's sort of what we wanted to hone in on today, is that ending of a relationship piece. In that, it ended because probably there was some dysfunction, there was some issues, and so if we can, I don't know if we want to talk about what are some of the typical ones and where do they come from? Or do we want to just start sort of some of the dysfunctional behaviors that maybe are typical, especially from my generation? I'm not sure which path, but essentially we want to sort of lay the foundation that there are fundamental issues with relationships that begin very, very early. Right.
Okay. So usually what I see are, most, when I say most, because of course there are exceptions, most relationships end just because the people were, incompatible. Maybe there was some dysfunction going on. And I always say that dysfunction occurs on the spectrum. There's no normal or perfect childhood. There's no normal or perfect relationship. I know that we have seen, videos and movies and things like that. I wasn't Leave It to Beaver and stuff like that, or, right. The stuff from the, early 90s and stuff that's not real. Yeah. Nobody has that kind of, relationship and things like that. So most relationships, there's some kind of dysfunction, but dysfunction isn't always someone's fault. It's more of just like, okay, this is the pattern that is kind of manifesting, and this is how we're meshing together. But then, of course, there are relationships where, the dysfunction has moved into more abuse category. And that's, of course, a completely different thing. But right. Most of the time, I would say relationships are just, two people that they kind of develop some unhealthy patterns. And it's a lot of times it's stuff that they bring in from childhood, patterns that they've learned. And because we all learn dysfunctional, unhealthy patterns from childhood, from our caregivers. And then we carry those into our relationships. And sometimes we're trying to kind of work through some of those traumas and things like that. And sometimes we don't even know what we're doing. Sometimes we're just like, wait, why are we having this impasse of, it's like you're speaking Greek and I'm speaking Russian. Like, what? Right. Like that's another common thing.
Sure. And what are some of the common ones? Like specifically some of the things that you see that you can trace back pretty easily, I would guess.
So I would say are like different ways of arguing. And I know that people are saying, sometimes people think that's weird that I bring up, arguing, like why would you want to argue? But the thing is if we can teach children how to have a conflict in a healthy way, then that's a really good thing, because then what ends up happening is children don't learn how to have conflict in a healthy way. So they both, both people of the couple, both members of the couple, they navigate the conflict so differently. So a lot of times what I'll see is almost like the distancer and the pursuer is something that we call it in therapy, where we have one person who's like, no, talk to me. What's going on? Tell me how you feel. Tell me what you're thinking. And the other person is like, I just want you to leave me alone. Now that in and of itself isn't dysfunctional. It's just a different communication style. But what ends up happening is if one person, it goes all the way into avoidance, where they're like, oh no, I want to pretend like the conversation never happened. And I want to just go on like it never happened and just, carry on as normal. And the other person's like, wait, but I want to talk about it and I want to kind of talk it to death. That's when it kind of goes into like dysfunction category. And that is something I see really common, really frequently with couples is this mismatched communication style or mismatched way of being able to navigate conflict that so then you're almost like fighting about the fight, like you're fighting about how you fought instead of the issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. So how do we trace that back? What do we trace that back to? So let's start with maybe and man, I know so many people, including myself, that can relate to this. The guy, typically it's the guy, I think.
Yeah, that's fine. You can go ahead and
the avoider, the guy who has an avoidant sort of strategy. How does that develop? What does that come from? What in childhood made that manifest?
So, and it's interesting too, you said the guy, because a lot of it is how we're conditioned through our gender. Women, we are conditioned to talk about stuff. I mean, look at little children on a playground and little girls are talking and boys, they don't sit around and talk, and it's not reinforced in the same way. Little girls, they're reinforced. Oh, talk about your feelings and talk and go to the bathroom together and talk. It's really reinforced in the behavior. Whereas little boys, they're told, you don't want to talk about that. I mean, don't be a sissy. And, and I like to think that that's getting better with each generation, but it is something that is very, I mean, even millennials were raised by boomers were raised by, I mean, it's very big. So what ends up happening is like we have, kids who maybe they watch their caregiver have this huge blowout fight, and then they both stomp into their rooms and they sleep in separate beds at night and they never talk about it again. And so then the kids learn, okay, that's how we navigate arguments, is we just kind of pretend it didn't happen. So then that person grows up, and he gets married and he doesn't know how to talk to his partner because he never saw his dad talk about feelings, and that was just something he never learned. And so it's an uncomfortable feeling. And so he learned, okay, I'm just gonna, shut down or, kind of go away and go outside. And my dad used to call it, like, go out and putter in the, in the garage, and whatever you do, and
so you're basically, you end up modeling the behavior of your parents, right?
Oh, for sure. And a lot of times, like we don't realize how much we model it, but kids will learn, because they're seeing things and they're seeing the conflict that's happening and they're seeing the conflict that's avoided. And, they grow up and a lot of times, even in the same family, you'll see kids who one will avoid conflict and one will be someone who's, maybe more anxious and more of the pursuer, even in the same family.
Every time I do these interviews, it just always makes me think about my own life. And I was just thinking about, it's a bit of a rabbit hole, but just how I'm probably not modeling the best behavior in terms of how I deal with my ex. Like, I don't talk to her. I don't communicate with her, via text, but not in front of the kids. Very, 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 very rarely. There's really nothing to say, nothing nice anyhow. And I do recall that rule about if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. So I generally,
are you worried that it will get into some kind of argument? Like, does past communication with her lead to that?
I honestly, if I'm being honest, I'm worried about interaction hurting me. right?
Oh, okay.
Like I just would rather avoid it.
Oh, okay.
You know what
I
I
can
mean?
understand that. Yep.
Like because when she left, it was very much and I understand the psychology. There's a lot of shit that I understand, philosophically, logically,
Mhm.
but so I understand why she had to say all this shit about me because it
Mhm.
made it easier for her to leave. I completely understand the logic behind it, but man, that shit hurts. And
But
so
that's hurtful. It
oh
doesn't change that.
fuck
Yeah.
yeah, it's terrible. The person that not only did she leave me, and the person that I loved and thought loved me, and that's another one of the things she said. I don't love you, and I don't think I ever loved you.
Oh.
We were together for 15 years.
Oh my.
So it's really, and so I don't want to. And I was accused of being a lying, manipulative narcissist, which is just, I don't even, everybody's a narcissist in today's.
That's another like soapbox that I get on is the overdiagnosing of exes and
Well,
yeah.
yeah, and again, I understand why people do it. I understand why she did it. She had to justify her actions, right? Because
Mhm.
if I was, well, he's okay, or I do love him, but maybe he's flawed or whatever. But if it's he is a complete and total piece of shit, it's a lot
Mhm.
easier for me to walk away from it all.
Oh,
And
for
so
sure.
I understand it, but it still hurts, and so I avoid that because it's hurtful. And
Mhm.
I try. I'm trying. I just interviewed Robert Enright, who's like the forgiveness guy, and I'm trying to get to a point where I can not be not avoiding her, not being so angry at her. But man, it's really, really hard because I learned as a kid to disassociate.
Oh yeah.
I shut down.
Oh
That's
yeah. That's so
what I did.
common. It's
Yeah,
so common.
yeah, and that's my that's my go-to. The silent treatment was like I deployed that shit like I was a ninja.
Yeah.
Little did I know that's really really bad for a relationship. But I worry. So long story. I worry that I'm not modeling the best behavior for them in terms of dealing with issues. But
So with that, because I get that all the time, and I always tell people like there is no perfect parent,
yeah,
and there actually literally is a term in psychology called the good enough parent. It's actually a thing. It's because we know that there's no such thing as a perfect parent, just there's no such thing as a perfect person. So it's actually a thing. You can Google good enough parenting, and I know that sounds horrible
yeah.
to say, but I'm telling you because what it means is like, are you doing the best you can with what you have in the moment?
Yeah. Well, it's
Yes.
to me, it sounds like a goal I can actually achieve.
Yes, like it's a thing. It's good enough parenting. There's a whole attachment theory based off of it. And I say that just to tell you, like, parenting is the hardest thing anyone will ever do. So I
It
can't
sure
imagine.
feels, yeah, it sure feels like
Yeah.
it, and doing it while going through the divorce. I mean, I was having a
Oh yeah.
conversation with somebody today about, oh well, and I mean, you and I had a little bit before we started about how
Mhm.
overwhelmed I am, and we are, I think, as a society, perhaps.
Mhm.
Um, and it can be so much more overwhelming when it's just you.
Oh, for
Um,
sure.
it can be very very debilitating, it feels like sometimes.
Mhm.
But
Oh, for
um
sure.
so let's talk about the other, if we can. We kind of touched on it, but so we have the sort of avoidant, the I don't want to talk about a guy, and we'll stick with the stereotypes, I guess.
Yeah, you can stick with stereotype. It works.
The female
Yeah.
that wants to fix it, or at least talk about it until they feel better.
Yeah.
What how does that manifest in them?
So that's what we would call the pursuer. And again, if we're going on stereotypes, it is, women are conditioned to be the caregivers. We are conditioned to be the pursuer, the emotional pursuer. Like I'm going to follow you in the room and you can tell me how you feel and let's talk about it and let's process it and da da da. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, I know. And that is real. And that's something that is very common. And of course, I've seen it, I work with couples of all genders. And so I've seen all different dynamics, but it is something that is pretty common. And so then what ends up happening is you have one person who's, we call the pursuer, and then the other person is more of the distancer. Sometimes it goes back to their attachment. So if one person has kind of an avoidant attachment and the other person has more of an anxious attachment, a lot of times that's usually what's kind of being manifested in the relationship dynamic. But so the person is, let's go with her. She gets that anxiety. Oh no, he's going to leave. And this isn't necessarily logical. It's not like, we're sitting there saying, okay, he's going to leave in as a logical statement. It's like, keep in mind, we're talking like little child brain back in the back of the head. The little child, inner child, if you will, is saying, oh no, they've walked out of the room. Mommy or daddy's leaving. I'm going to be abandoned. I can't take care of myself. And so then it's almost like this panic. And I got to quick follow him into the room. Please tell me what is going on. Let's talk about it. And because in the moment, to someone with an anxious attachment, arguing about something is better than nothing. It's better than silence, because silence means I've been abandoned. Silence means I've been left alone. Whereas, to the other person, they're thinking, I just need a minute.
Yeah.
Just give me a minute or however long. And so then sometimes that's when you see the most explosive arguments, is when, both people aren't getting their needs met in that way.
It is, and I think we're going to kind of get into this, but are these attachment styles and argument styles, are they dysfunctional in nature, or are they just how we are? And as long as we navigate that, and in other words, she knows, and I hate to say which one's first, but fuck it. She knows I'm avoidant and I need time. And she gives me my time, but then I have to respect the fact that she's anxious and worried and pursuing, and I have to give her my time eventually. Right. I mean, it's not the goal is the goal to eliminate or not eliminate, but maybe lessen, maybe eliminate those two styles? Or is it a matter of meshing them together? Like, in other words, is it a guy has to stop avoiding and just fucking talk about it, and she has to stop pushing and just relax? Or is it sort of working together in terms of like, okay, I know he needs time, and I know I need to come back. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So when in doing couples therapy, that's usually what clinicians will say, is that each one of you needs to give an inch. So I need you, if you, John, usually take 2-3 hours to yourself, and you, Sally, pursue him instantly, I'm going to need you, John, to reduce it to an hour, and you, Sally, to give him, those 59.5 minutes before you go knock on the door. And I know it's a lot more, I'm trying to make it a lot more simplistic, in the therapy session, you're working on tools and ways and things like that. But so to answer your question, it's a little bit of everything. Attachment styles are something that we all have. If some of us are blessed with a secure attachment style, some of us have anxious attachment, avoidant attachment. Sometimes there's combinations, and you can take these little like fun quizzes on Google and come up with yours and stuff like that. And some people read it and they're like, yep, that's me. Some people are like, oh, that's interesting. But when it goes into dysfunctional category or territory is when you're infringing on other person's boundaries. So like me, like I could say, or Sally can say, I know I have an anxious attachment. I know that when you walk out of the room, I'm anxious. However, that doesn't give me the right to then go break down the door and while you're trying to take a shower by yourself, because I need you to talk to me. And you might, John might know, hey, I need some time to myself. I have a little bit more of I kind of need some time to myself before I can process this. It doesn't give you the right to just leave and go down to the bar for 3 days. Both of you have the responsibility of like, so usually what I do with couples is I will say, you need to agree on a time and you need to stick to the time. Like, if usually if usually John needs 3 hours, I'll say, look, take an hour, and Sally needs to know that in 1 hour you will be home. Because she's waiting and she's counting down the minutes.
Again, just thinking about, this is like describing my relationship to it.
Oh yeah. Many. It's probably one of the most common dynamics that we see.
Yeah. So on that note, we want to talk about, how do we change some of these things? And I'm going to guess that the first step in this is knowing what kind of argument and or attachment style, or, know thyself, right? I mean, if you don't know where you're at, how the hell are you going to change it? So I'm guessing step one is figure out how do you handle conflict? Is that fairly
That's
accurate?
usually how I phrase it. I actually work I work with a lot of men, and maybe it's just me. I've had 4 brothers growing. I don't know if I just like know, I don't come, usually when I'm working with men, I don't come at it with like, oh, you know your attachment style. It's like what's your conflict style? Like, are you like a leave me alone kind of guy, or are you like a look, let's just put this to bed kind of thing so we can go to bed kind of thing? Like what do you want to do? Like, how do you want to get through this? Because I find that, going and talking about attachment styles, sometimes people kind of get like a little lost, and, we're getting into like psychobabble stuff, and not all the time. And I know I'm going off of stereotypes, but I also, that sometimes it's true that sometimes I think people are just like that. People are just like, I don't want to hear all the, the stuff behind it, but let me know, what I need to do to change this. And so I usually like saying, what's your conflict style? Are you more of like I need a minute to myself, or are you more of like, let's talk about it now? So that's one of the first things, is just learning, what is your preference? And then also validating that. Like, if you're someone who needs to talk about it, you're not going to all of a sudden wake up tomorrow and be like, oh yeah, that's fine, we can take 3 hours. It's not going to work. You're going to be crawling out of your skin with anxiety, waiting for your partner to come home.
Yeah. And I would, I'm speculating here. I would think that for the avoidant type, the give me a minute type, which could turn into days, and then we never talk about it. Yay.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So it seems like it would be much easier for that person in some ways, or at least initially, right? Because they get their space, they're like, oh God, thank God. And then maybe they forget about it or whatever. So I would just speculation and guessing here. The person that has to like pump the brakes, so to speak, must be really, really difficult. And I'm sure it's the same when and hopefully if it does come back around. But I'm guessing that anxious sort of person, that must be really difficult to flip that switch and be like, oh yeah, okay, now you can have 2 hours, no problem, fine, we had a therapy session and I get it.
No, it's very hard. And usually what ends up happening is we work on like self-soothing techniques. If you need to go to the gym, if you need to take a hot bath, if you need to stand in the middle of the room and scream, and listen to music, I mean, whatever you need to do. And then we work on ways to because a lot of times with couples, like, I'll find that one person, maybe their idea of needing space is, the whole night. And the other person's like, I cannot fall asleep, and it's not like one person's needs are better than the others. I mean, sometimes, with couples, it's like you're working on, look, can you maybe give her 5 minutes of attention, or can you give him 5 minutes of attention? And then with the understanding that both of you will talk about it in the morning, can you agree to that? Because it's midnight and you want to go to bed, that kind of thing.
So with that said, right, it sounds like there's strategies for those types of people, which is good. How about the other guy who eventually has to, come around and talk about some shit he probably don't want to talk about? Like, what are the strategies for that guy, and how do you coach him up, so to speak?
So it's the same kind of thing of like working on ways to self-soothe. Just like the person who, needs to talk about stuff right now can't all of a sudden be comfortable waiting 7 hours. The person who needs a lot of time to themselves, or maybe doesn't want to talk about it at all, is not all of a sudden going to be comfortable having a 3-hour conversation. So what I'll say to couples is, look, if you feel like it's going to be a 2-hour conversation, set a timer for 30 minutes, because what happens is after the first couple rounds of conversation, you've kind of lost the person anyway. We're not hearing 100% of what the other person says. And so, also I'll tell people, find 2 or 3 points and say them, and then get the off your chest. Sometimes couples have a ritual that lets the other person know, I still love you and I'm still here. I just need some space. And that's different for each couple. I have some couples, they do like a forehead touch, or like like a fist bump or whatever, which is like a playful way of being like, I still love you. I'm not going anywhere. We'll talk about this tomorrow. I will see you tomorrow. And that helps both of them. It helps the person who needs that self-soothing because they're anxious, and it helps the person that's like, I don't want to talk about this right now. So like they kind of both get it.
essentially what you're saying is relationships are fucking hard.
Yes, they're just like the hardest thing. Like I know what I said earlier about parenting being hard. Well, yeah.
I mean, it takes work, right? You can't
so much,
expect. And to back to your earlier point, and I wanted to touch on that too. Is I think we've been screwed by Disney and Hallmark and all these fucking shows and movies that it's easy. You know, One, what a bunch of fucking nonsense.
I know, like, oh well, this is how it's going to be, and then the second that they kiss, they go into never whatever they go into happily ever after just after the first kiss, and it's like no.
I don't think so. So I want to shift a little bit, and I don't know, we talked about healing in the pre-interview, and this is something that comes up all the time in the groups that I run. Guys, and I think women probably do it too, but I know in my group it's all men, and I see a lot of guys that just want to run to the next relationship right away. Or at least pretty quickly. And
that's a common trauma response.
First of all, I mean, I can't think that that's a good idea, but let's say it's been a little while, 6 months. I think that's still too soon, but let's say maybe 8 months. I don't know. Here's the question. Can you go through the healing process with someone in a new relationship? Or do you absolutely have to take your time and fully heal, whatever that means? And those are, again, definitions, like, everything's different to everybody. But is it possible to get into a new relationship and heal through that new relationship?
So the thing is it really is different for each person. If you're still healing with a new person, my gut is always with that one, no. Like, yes. Now what ends up happening is sometimes people are at different stages of healing. Like there are some people who, by the time the divorce is finalized, they're like, I'm ready because I've been emotionally grieving the relationship for so long. And, since way before the divorce was even started, that I've done all of my stages of grieving and I'm ready. And then
isn't that typical? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you go ahead.
Isn't that typically the woman? Because she started the process way before. I mean, typically.
I've seen it, honestly. I've probably seen it the same because I know a lot of people who it's usually the person who is like emotionally left the relationship sooner, which necessarily isn't always the person who is the one who says, hey, let's end it. But the person because sometimes what happens is the person who tries to call the other person's bluff by filing paperwork or breaking up. Sometimes they're trying to call, not all the time, but and then the other person wasn't ready. And so a lot of times what happens is the person who's like emotionally kind of checked out and they already have started the leaving process, just because their underwear is still in the drawer next to yours doesn't mean that they haven't checked out, which is sad. And it isn't always the case. And there is, of course, some grieving that comes from ending of a relationship, but I see people who leave a relationship and then a couple of months later, they meet the next level of their life and that's great. And then I've seen other people who they need a few years.
And how do you, and again, this is probably subjective, right? It's up to but how do you, let's say, for instance, and I know this, for instance, because I do hear it quite often. I'm a man and she says she wants a divorce and I find out she's cheating and all these things. And we're still living together, but we decided we're going to get divorced, but we're still living together. And I say that I've been done for a while and I'm fine, but yet things that she does, A, you're still living together. B, things that she does still annoy and upset you. Mm-hmm. Is that a flag? If someone's still able to push your buttons, does that mean that you're not healed?
Usually, if they're pushing your trauma wound buttons versus your human buttons, because like we as people are going to get annoyed by other human beings, and it doesn't mean that we have a personal relationship with them. So if for me, someone in my home is going to annoy me, if they're always in my home, but if they're pushing your trauma wound buttons, you rarely do I see someone who can still live in the same house with someone who they've broken up with.
Right.
That's very rare. I mean, I've seen it, but it's like both those people have to have very healthy, secure attachment, very healthy backgrounds they've done, or they've done a lot of work, because it's just, unless both people are very secure and very healthy emotionally, it's usually not a good idea.
What do you think? What do you think the percentage of the population is actually truly emotionally healthy? Like 5?
Oh my gosh. I know I get asked that and I'm like, this sounds really sad, but I don't know. I mean, so many people have trauma, and I think right now it's being normalized to even talk about it.
Yeah.
So I think now is like the generation, now this is the time to talk about it. So it's not like, people are saying, oh, do you think trauma is getting worse? No, I think people are just talking about it more, whereas previous generations ignored it. But I mean, that's a good question. I don't know.
I just have, and maybe I'm cynical and negative. I don't think so.
No, I understand.
I think there are a lot of fucked up people.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it like they're bad per se, or they're not even.
No, it's not their fault. It's not their fault. And then those people fall for other people. Yeah. Who are also fucked up. And then, and they have their trauma wounds and they trigger each other's trauma wounds. And then it's just like, fire.
So you talked about if they're pushing your trauma wounds, or if they're just pushing your human buttons, so to speak. What are some of the specific things that you can tell? Like, okay, that, like, if you hear from a person, I don't know, she stayed out, she didn't come home last night and stayed at her boyfriend's place, or I don't know, like, what are some of the things that are maybe sort of specific-ish about, like, that you could be like, oh, okay, he's not healed?
So for me, that's why it's so hard with people who've had a romantic relationship to live together. Until you can look at the person with complete neutrality, almost like a roommate. Like, if I have a roommate who comes home, at 4:00 in the morning, am I annoyed because they woke me up when they stubbed their foot on the coffee table? Or am I annoyed because they came home at 4 a.m, and where were they? Right. If I'm annoyed because they woke me up because they stubbed their foot, right, that's a human annoyance. If I'm like, where were you and what were you doing? Then the curiosity is like, telling me that I'm more interested in what the person was doing, because it's a boundary, and it's impossible to have, when you've ended a relationship, it's impossible to keep that boundary.
This stuff is so complicated, but yet fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
I think I missed my calling in life. I should have been a therapist, but
I've heard you say that in other podcasts, and I was like, yeah, it's not too late.
I had this conversation with my own therapist, and he's like, well, you could still become a licensed social worker. And I'm like, yeah, and that has clinical hours. And I don't know, maybe I should really fucking look into it. I don't know. Cause I love this shit. I think it's fascinating. I think, it's much better to understand at least a little bit how this thing up here works, rather than just willy-nilly going through life.
It's so fascinating.
Yeah. I wish I would have done that. But I think, I mean, we covered pretty much everything that we talked about in the pre-interview. And I think there's so much here. I guess one of the things that's popping up in my head is in terms of your clients, the people that you see, do you see, just out of curiosity, I think you kind of mentioned you see more men than you do women?
I actually have a lot of men who seek me out as survivors of relationship trauma. And I know that sounds really vague, but it basically is just saying, like, were you traumatized in a relationship? Were you, whether it was a victim of a violence or a survivor of violence, or whether it was just a traumatic situation. And I've had a lot of people, seek me out for that. So yeah, I do. I see a lot of men.
And what, in terms of the healing process, I'm sure some things are fairly universal. Is there a difference? So you notice a difference between your clients, your male and female clients, in terms of their healing and time frame, steps, tools, whatever? Is it just universal?
I would say that there's a definite difference between, and I know I always kind of talk about the generations, but between boomers and millennials, it's almost like, if each generation we're a step on a staircase. It's like boomers to millennials, the person was trying to see how many steps they could because it's so different, versus millennials to, what are we, the next one, Generation X. I always forget what my students are. The next one is Generation X, but it's not as much of a leap, but because millennials are a lot more able to, say, hey, yeah, this happened to me and it was really shitty. And I own it. Whereas boomers, they're still of that, like, there's so much shame. But I say all that to say that men everywhere in the world are shamed for trauma. They're shamed for coming forward. They're shamed for admitting that they've had trauma. You shouldn't have that. It should, man up and, all it is just, go find someone else and and, just have a beer. Like, there's all these like horrible messages that, that kind of get you to like push it back down. So I would say that it's a combination. It depends on, I've had people that come in and their parents are really open with them about talking, and then they've done a lot of work themselves. And then I've had a lot of people who have just had so much shame from it that it takes a lot to open up.
Yeah. Kaytee, I want to thank you. This is great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure we can do it again. There's no shortage of things to talk about, I think,
for sure,
in this realm. I want to ask one more thing, and then the final question. And that is, sort of goes back to your article. Is it possible for people that have been through trauma to find themselves in a healthy relationship?
Oh, yes, it is. And I would say it takes work. I mean, there are times where, like I'll say to my partner and we'll kind of like look at each other and I'm like, wait, was I doing the thing I do? And he's like, yeah, cause I get that. I get the anxious and I get in the thought loop and the and he's like, whoa, calm down, and so I say that to say, if you have enough self-awareness to be able to say, okay, this is the thing I do. And to be able to say that to your partner, like, I realize that I'm more of the pursuer. I'm working on it. Can we work together? That kind of thing. But both people really need to be able to be self-aware and to be able to work on it. Because if only one person's working on it, only one person's self-aware, a lot of resentment will happen and things like that.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's good. It's good news for me,
yeah,
at least.
But yes, it is possible. Yes, absolutely. Every day.
So then the final question, as everyone knows, is what words of wisdom would you impart to a man who had just found out that she wants a divorce, or she's left, or she's cheated, or she's filing? What are some words of wisdom you would impart to that man?
So for that, I always want to say, validate your truth. Validate your truth. I want all men to know, like, this is your experience, and shame is not going to take that away, but increasing self-compassion can help you along the way. Like, right now is the time to validate this experience and say, yes, this is going to be traumatic. This is going to be shitty. And validate that, and validate the need for increased compassion. Because what happens is, I see a lot of men, I'm going to put a lid on this. I'm going to put it in the back burner and I'm going to try to focus on something else. And it's still going to be here Friday. It's still going to be here Monday.
Excellent. I couldn't agree more. Kaytee, again, thank you very much. How do people find you? What's the best way to contact Kaytee?
All right. So my website, it's my full name, Caitlin Gillis, LCSW.com. And I'm also under Clara's Voice on Instagram, Clara. And there's 2 underscores, Clara's Voice on Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again, Kaytee. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you so much for watching and or listening. Thank you to Nick Coyle and Lifer for allowing me to use their song, Born Again, which you're hearing now and at the intro to the podcast. Thank you to Justin Dillahanty and all of my brothers at the Alpha Code. Please visit the website, risingphoenixpodcast.com, to connect with me and other like-minded men who are looking to thrive and grow after their divorce. And remember to surround yourself with people who add value to your life, who challenge you to be greater than you were yesterday, who sprinkle magic into your existence like you do to theirs. Life is not meant to be done alone. Find your tribe. Take care.